For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hi, this is the gist on Strat News Global. I'm Surya Gangadharan, and the focus this evening is on China. Now, we had a spate of media reports of the last perhaps over a month about China's economy slowing down, that its property market is collapsing under a heavy debt burden, that unemployment is growing, largely driven by COVID shutdowns that even closed Shanghai in June. So, does that mean the economy is going bust? So that's the question I'm going to put to my guest, Ananth Krishnan, correspondent of The Hindu, based in Beijing. Ananth, glad to have you. We are going to get a reporter's perspective from you on ground level. And since you're on the seat of all the action, tell us what's the buzz in Beijing? Is the economy slowing down? Is there concern? What do people tell you?
Thank you so much, Surya, for having me. Just to sort of give you a comparison, so I was here in the aftermath of the financial crisis as well, back in 2009 and that period. I mean, for me, there's no doubt that speaking to people here, speaking to whether it's small business owners or even people from big companies and getting a sense of their long-term plans, it's much more downbeat now than even it was in the worst aftermath of the financial crisis. Just to give you a perspective, if we were to compare then and now. And so I think that just gives you a sense of how bad the sentiment is in China right now. You mentioned some of the causes to that, which we can get into. There's, of course, the property bubble that was coming. There was some self-inflicted kind of that they've done, such as the regulatory intervention in the tech sector. And of course, I think more than anything, Surya, there's one thing that I think is dominating everything in China right now, 2 years into the pandemic, is that they're still continuing with the zero COVID policy. And with that, it comes a lot of uncertainty. You don't know when you're going to get locked down. You don't know if your travel plans are going to go ahead. And of course, the worst thing for businesses or businesses that want to grow or hire people, I think, is uncertainty. So I think that that's kind of casting a shadow on many things in China right now.
Mm-hmm. So, given the disruption to the economy, is the leadership alive to the problems on the ground? Are they doing anything to mitigate it?
So, yeah, I think that the leadership is aware of this situation and the economic challenges. And I think the dilemma they face is between continuing zero COVID and economic growth, because I think it's clear that you cannot have both. But the problem is that they don't want to open up, because every country that has emerged out of the pandemic has done so by seeing lots of cases, whether even Singapore, which was held up as a great example of how to exit with minimum deaths. And that's something politically is untenable for Xi Jinping before the party congress that's supposed to take place in October, because he has held up the China model as a big difference from the West, which had millions of cases. So I think until the party congress, there's no sense of an exit strategy, which would, for example, a sign of them opening up would be a targeted booster vaccination campaign. But you don't hear much about vaccinations in Beijing. All the focus is on testing. Someone like me, I have to test every 72 hours to get a green code. And without that, I can't take a taxi. I can't enter a hotel. I can't even enter my own apartment block if I don't do a test every 72 hours. So that's the kind of intense control that there is. And I think he's willing to take this economic price because of this big Congress that's coming up. But I feel it's unsustainable, Surya. And I think that after the Congress, the economic pain is so much, they will have to reconsider this current balance that they have.
So the concern is basically political. He doesn't want anything to mar his rise to a third term. But isn't there a danger of public unrest?
I think that in terms of gauging public opinion, Surya, it's quite complicated here. From my own sort of conversations with people, what I found is in Shanghai, there's a huge, understandably, people have been through a trauma in Shanghai, because some people have been locked up locked up in their homes for 60 days plus. And I think that people have felt enough is enough. I think here in Beijing and in many other cities in China, Surya, I think it's important to remember they haven't gone through what Shanghai has gone through, whether it's in Beijing or a place like Changsha and Hunan, which I first flew into. They've had normalcy for the last 2 years. I think a section of the population that can't travel freely, that whose businesses are affected, certainly would like a review of it. They feel the pandemic policies have cast a huge toll on business. Hiring is down. Unemployment is a big problem for college graduates. But I also found on the flip side, Surya, why I say the views are complicated is that people who, of course, read in the news about the deaths that have happened elsewhere in the world, they feel it unfathomable that China would tolerate having mass deaths. And I think that especially in tier 2 towns, the healthcare system would be overrun if they were to open up tomorrow. And because of the fact that people in China have been told that COVID is still a life-threatening disease, if you get COVID, you go to the hospital, you have to isolate. So there has to be a huge mental change in China coming from the government's messaging to change how people look at COVID, to focus on vaccinations, and to speak of an exit strategy. And none of those three things are happening at the moment. And if you ask me, is it political? The only answer I can suggest why none of these three things are happening, the only thing that I can think of is because of the fact that they don't want this record to be blemished, because the economic, as I just said, I think that at some point they have to begin to think of an exit strategy if they want China to open up to the world again.
Is this problem largely confined to the eastern seaboard, or is it all over?
I think you've had cases or sort of surges pop up all over the country at different points, and how it's worked so far. First, it happened in Xi'an, where they went through about more than a month of lockdown, but then they threw everything they had at it. People were confined to their homes, and then Xi'an came out of it. Shanghai has been probably the worst example, and many other Chinese cities have looked at Shanghai as an example of what not to do because they weren't really active when cases started to spread, especially with Omicron. They were not very active in locking down. But I think Beijing, for example, has come up with a model that at least the Chinese leadership believes it's something that other cities should follow. And the Beijing model basically is that every resident is tested every 3 days. The minute there's a case, they immediately sort of put in quarantine the close contacts. It can be several hundred people, and they test them repeatedly. And so far, Beijing has avoided a big wave. So it's a mixed record. I think, as you know, I mean, China is a huge country and there's a huge variance in different provinces. And I think that's why I would also make the point that when you look at a national picture in China for COVID, actually doesn't tell you very much. And I think if you look at a regional picture, you get an idea of how different places have been faring.
Let's talk about the property bubble, which we've been reading about for some time. How serious is it, and how badly is it affecting the government's ability to, is the government being able to manage it? How are they doing it?
I think, Surya, on the property sector, they seem to be in a little bit of a hard place where initially, I think most economists would say they did the right thing when they sent a message to developers, which is how this crisis began, saying that they won't forever look the other way as they continue to pile up debt. And when some of these big developers were unable to pay back their loans, I think initially they wanted to take a firm line. And I think a lot of economists felt that was the right thing to do because of the fact that you've had this bubble that's been building up for so long now. And it was about time that they began to take measures to tackle this growing ballooning debt. But the problem was, coupled with other things that were happening in China with the zero COVID related slowdowns, with the problems the tech sector here has been facing. I think it's kind of all of these problems started ballooning up. And I think now they've begun to backtrack a little bit. And I think they've been quietly giving targeted bailouts to some property developers. But again, this is just a quick fix. And I think in the long term, there's no escaping the fact that I think those days of growth for the property sector, which really propelled China's GDP for the last 10, 15, 20 years, I think that's over. And it's very clear if you look at the real estate prices, especially if you leave out Beijing and Shanghai and the big cities where I think prices will still continue to grow. I think if you look at tier 2, tier 3 towns, especially, now you've come to this unprecedented situation where property developers have essentially run out of money. Their projects are stopped midway, and now people are actually in what is quite an unprecedented kind of protest. People have stopped paying their mortgages because they're saying that they've paid up for houses that are not going to be built. So how it's going to play out, I think that some developers probably will have to go bust. I think they will have targeted bailouts because, as you said, there's also this idea of social unrest they have to keep in mind, because ultimately in China, according to numbers I've seen, for many people, something like 70% of their savings is in their homes. So for them, it's a life or death issue as far as their own savings are concerned. So the government can't afford to let people lose their savings. So I think that at the beginning of the show, you mentioned, is it going to be a big crisis? My own hunch is I don't think there'll be like an immediate big financial crisis, but a long, drawn-out period where you'd have targeted bailouts, you'd have some people going bust, you'd have growth slowing down, and the government intervening where it can to prop it up. So I would say it's more likely you'll see a long period of slowing growth rather than a huge crash. Is a sense that I would have.
Mhm. Now, you mentioned this briefly about the crackdown on big tech. Is there signs that they are now kind of easing up on that?
I think so. Again, like the property sector intervention, I think the government felt it was something they needed to do. And I think it's a similar sort of question that governments all over the world, in the US and India, are dealing with, which is how much power should big tech companies have when it comes to
Yeah.
having access to consumer data and the like. And I think that the Chinese government felt that, I think a couple of companies, I would highlight Alibaba as one and Tencent as the other. Living in China, Surya, it's hard to explain how dominant Alibaba and Tencent are in the e-commerce space. Every payment that you make, whether it's for your electricity bills, whether it's buying anything, it's either done through Tencent's WeChat Pay or it's done through Alibaba's Alipay. And I think the government was uncomfortable with the idea of these tech monopolies coming up, and these were becoming huge power centers in of themselves, and they wanted to send a message to them that in China, I suppose that only the party can be the one sort of big structure that can concentrate power, and you if you're beginning to challenge that, I think there are some lines that you cannot cross. And I think that was a message they felt they had to send, and in a sense, it's understandable because the dilemma that many governments are dealing with. Are you really comfortable with tech companies having a monopoly over people's information and essentially killing all competition? The problem again for them was their performance has now taken a hit. Towards the third week of August, you had numbers coming out from Tencent, which I think for the first time posted declining revenues, and they aren't hiring. And again, this feeds into the problem they're having of youth unemployment. So I think with all of these challenges we are talking about, difficulty for them is there's no clear answer. It's a measured approach they have to take, in the sense that obviously there are these long stemming problems they have to address, but then how far they go is going to have an effect on growth of the economy, is going to have an effect on unemployment. So they can't go as far as they want, and I think for them right now the challenge is finding that kind of right medium.
Mhm. So, are you able to meet young people and talk to them? Are there fears about their jobs, their savings, the future? What do they say?
No, absolutely. I think that compared to, say, when I first came here, now almost 14 years ago, and there was such a buoyant feeling about the Chinese economy. And I would hear stories of lots of people who were educated in the US, and this has happened in the last 10 years as well, who are coming back because they felt, especially in the tech sector, more than anything else, tech sector was a huge opportunity. And you had people who are overseas educated coming back in droves because they saw such a big opportunity in China. Compare that to now, where I think that one of the interesting trends you're seeing is this uptick in people who are sitting for government exams, given that the private sector has been taking such a beating. That once again you're seeing the government jobs as something that people are queuing up for, whether it's working for state-owned enterprises. When I first came here, people would tell me that the last thing they wanted was to work in the state sector because they felt that it was all political. There's no drive, there's no ambition. but the fact that you're now seeing record sort of people sitting for government exams gives you a sense of how the private sector in China has really taken a beating. And they were the ones that were kind of the big hope, I think, for young people coming into the economy. And I think that one of the more interesting offshoots is that you're having this phenomenon in China that they call lying flat, which is young people who kind of graduate and say, listen, we don't want to be a part of this rat race. They go to a small village somewhere and open up a cafe and, find fulfillment doing other things. And it's interesting that the Chinese leadership has come out quite strongly against this, saying that, lying flat is giving up and people should, contribute and work for the economy. So it's one section of the population's reaction is to kind of just say, enough is enough and we'll find other things to do.
And the demographic changes, is this something that is talked about?
I think so, but I think that's less of a concern right now because the immediate concerns, I would say, are what is going to happen to housing prices, what is going to happen to jobs for college graduates, and what is going to happen to the zero COVID policy. People I know here who run their businesses, I know, for example, someone who has a chain of restaurants in Beijing, and a huge number of them have been shut down because of the uncertainty of how long they can stay open. If there's a single case in their district, they are told to shut down. And when you have this kind of uncertainty because of zero COVID, it's terrible for businesses to plan for forget about the next 5 years. They can't plan for the next 2 months.
Yeah.
So hiring has taken a big beating. And in that sense, I think that what people really crave, I think, is policy certainty. And until I think there's a measure of policy certainty, it's difficult to see how this kind of current sentiment change, even though the government's coming out with various subsidies and stimulus measures. I think that this overarching problem of uncertainty is a huge problem for businesses. Even one point I should, for viewers in India especially, it's hard to emphasize how difficult it is to travel within China right now. I'm in Beijing, and if I want to go to another city, I have to take a test and apply for a health code from that particular city. And different cities have their own quarantine measures. So I was planning to travel somewhere for a story. And then as I was about to travel, I was told that the quarantine rules changed. And if I landed there, I would have to be doing enforced quarantine for 3 days because Beijing had one case. So these are the kind of things that make it impossible for businesses to grow when it's very difficult domestically to travel and move around, and mobility is not what it was pre-COVID-19. So I think a lot of these things have to change if the economy is going to rebound, and if they're going to, their big hope is getting consumption to drive the economy. And consumption right now is taking such a beating because of these current measures.
So last question, Ananth. How have all these crises affected the way China looks at the outside world? I mean, has it influenced their relations with other countries, policies? I mean, how does that work?
One of the curious things, Surya, is that despite China being still close to the outside world, it's one of the only major countries that right now hasn't regularized or normalized international travel. All international travelers have to do quarantine, and visas to China are still extremely difficult. But the strange thing, Surya, which the Chinese government keeps pointing to, is that 2021 and 2022 were record years for China's trade. So they say that it's because of zero COVID that they could keep China's manufacturing engine growing. And I think if you look at India-China as an example, Surya, India-China trade has been at record levels in 2021 and 2022.
Absolutely,
and I think that, I think this perception that people had that COVID would lead people to move their supply chains out of China hasn't happened. And if you look at 2022 August compared to 2019 August, China's manufacturing has actually increased the level of dependence that countries have on it. So that's one side of the equation, even though in terms of their openness to the world, interactions to the world, I think they realize it's untenable, which is why in July last month, you had them beginning to start issuing visas. You had them beginning to launch direct flights to many countries because I think they realize it's impossible to continue doing this because China's own diplomatic sort of agendas. And China, on the one hand, they're talking about, you've covered before, Surya, their favored phrases, this community of shared destiny that they call it, which is how do they, on the one hand, talk about that when they are the only country that's still walled off from the rest of the world? So I think that long term, they know it's unsustainable. And I think that after this party congress is over in 2023, they will have to consider coming up with an exit strategy. But it's going to be difficult because I think people here are still so kind of afraid and averse of COVID that it's going to take a huge effort from them on multiple fronts: messaging, vaccination, and planning an exit. And so far, there's no attempt at that as far as I can see.
In fact, I read the other day that the medical students from India are being allowed to return.
That's right. So on August 22nd, they said that starting now, they can apply for visas. But it's still a long way off, Surya, because direct flights from India to China haven't resumed yet. So for them to travel, it's extremely difficult. They have to go through third countries, and it's very expensive. And some of the universities are not issuing the letters that are needed for them to come because their provinces might have COVID cases. So again, I think until zero COVID is completely lifted, maybe some students will come back in batches, but it's nowhere near a return to pre-COVID normalcy.
And since they don't recognize the Indian vaccine, I suppose they will insist on the Chinese vaccine being administered?
I think for visas so far, Surya, for Indian businessmen who have come back, for example, they are recognizing the Indian vaccine unofficially, in the sense that if you're vaccinated, it's not recognized in their apps here, but you are still allowed to come to China. You still have to go through quarantine and the like. So they aren't differentiating between the kind of vaccines people have taken. Even if you've taken Chinese vaccines, you still have to quarantine. So I think the focus here still is on quarantining, testing, and rather than the idea of vaccine mandates is something that they haven't really taken up in a big way, in part because there's a lot of vaccine hesitancy among elderly Chinese. And it's very interesting that even though the government can be forceful on many issues, they've tread very, very carefully when it comes to forcing people on vaccine mandates. And I think that that has to be something for them to consider if they really want to open up.
Yeah, very interesting. Great insight, Ananth. And thanks very much for your time. We are completely out of time, and I think we need to. But clearly, China is going to be far more interesting, I think, after November when the party congress is held. So let's forward to that. Thanks very much, Ananth. Great having you.
Thank you so much. Always a pleasure, Surya.
And for those of you who joined us on this conversation, thank you for tuning in. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Follow us on social media and Twitter. Thank you and good night.